Okay, can you hear me? Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the State Archives and the Department of the Natural and Cultural Resources. Thank you for coming to our Juneteenth program honoring Peter Oliver and his legacy. So now I'm going to turn this over to Christy Williams, and she will introduce the panel and we will get started. Thank you again for coming.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the North Carolina Archives for having us here today. This is truly a culmination of decades of work by people who aren't even here today living, about a story of a man who is no longer living, but a family that has survived generations and has done so. We are so excited to be here with the Oliver family and descendants that are here in the room. And I know that those people online, that we are proud to be able to tell a story that needs to be told in our state and nationally and locally for Winston-Salem and Salem, North Carolina. I want to also take a moment. This is the 224th year since the actual day when Peter Oliver signed for his freedom. His emancipation came through complex circumstances that we will only touch on today. I want to share that this is a story about one man, but there are so many across the nation that we aren't able to acknowledge. And so I'd like to take a moment of silence to acknowledge our past and be appropriate in understanding the silence of a moment that is necessary for all of our hearts. So if you could join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. So today we are so pleased to have Old Salem. I will allow each of our presenters to share who they are. I'm Christy Willow Williams. I'm with Creative Corridors Coalition that is leading the historic site of the farm and homestead. It'll be called the Peter Oliver Pavilion Gallery. And it is a dream right now. Someone asked what it looks like. It's grass. So there is not a whole lot there, but the dream is because of the great deep work of individuals that are seated here, the heavy amount of archival information of which you'll hear about today, and the descendants of the Oliver family who have been cherished by so many throughout our small community of Winston-Salem and throughout Winston-Salem's greater area, North Carolina and beyond. So we honor the Oliver family today. This is your story, and we are honored to be a part of sharing a little bit of what we have come to understand through many areas and the stories that linger through the Oliver family. I will now turn to the right, and Martha.
Oh, good afternoon. My name is Martha Hartley. I'm the Director of Moravian Research at Old Salem Museums and Gardens, and it's an honor and pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sabrina Garrity, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Moravian Church Archives, Southern Province in Winston-Salem. And it is also really lovely to be here. Thank you for having us.
Hello, everyone. My name is George Jones. I am a descendant, 8th generation descendant of Peter Oliver. I am happy to be here. I'm happy to see family. I am the Executive Director for Partners for Environmental Justice here in Raleigh, and I'm happy to be here.
And I want to give honor to his mother that just arrived as well. That was a tearful moment for both of us. Welcome today, and we're praying for your husband as well, and thankful to be a part of telling the story. I have been mindful recently that this story of freedom has always got a place in telling the story of pain, and that the pain story always has a part of telling the part in freedom. And so be mindful as you hear this, to listen with intensity. I hope you question and come into this with an inquisitiveness for the future, because there's so much more of the story than we're able to share today, which is part of why we are lingering here in the archives. So thank you so much. And I'd like to turn this over to Martha Hartley now.
Thank you, Christy. You know who I am. Peter Oliver transcended time and place with confidence, tenacity, and courage. Aspects of his life are revealed through historic documents, which scholars have pursued at the Moravian Archives, the State Archives of North Carolina, and other repositories. Peter Oliver distinguished himself in ways unparalleled in the history of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Today, Winston-Salem is a vibrant city of 250,000 people. Called the City of Arts and Innovation, Winston-Salem gets its credentials from the Moravian Church, which began building the community in the 1750s. Old Salem's antique buildings are prominent in the foreground here. Old Salem is a National Historic Landmark District and living history museum that preserves and interprets the Moravian town of Salem, founded in 1766, and where Peter Oliver lived. The 90-acre neighborhood includes residences, museum exhibit buildings, Moravian church entities, Salem Academy and College, and St. Philip's Moravian Church, the oldest standing African-American church in North Carolina. Since at least the 1980s, research at the museum has included Peter Oliver, with examples here from the 1990s. Mel White was Old Salem's director of African-American programs, whose important genealogy work discovered and connected branches for the Oliver family 25 years ago. Peter Oliver was a beloved husband and father, a skilled artisan, a devout Moravian, and he is a revered ancestor. He was born May 10th, 1766 in Virginia, and he died on September the 28th, 1810 in Salem, North Carolina. Peter Oliver's adult life was lived in the Moravian world. The Moravian Church is a Protestant denomination with ancient roots in Bohemia and the philosophy of John Huss. The modern church was born in the 1720s in Saxony through the patronage and leadership of Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf, his Philadelphian ideas, and revival of the ancient unity. The renewed Moravian Church embarked on global mission work and in 1741 established Bethlehem, Pennsylvania as the first congregation town in North America. A decade later, Count Zinzendorf came to an agreement with Lord Granville to buy 100,000 acres of his North Carolina land. Inspired by Austria's Wachau Valley, the new Moravian land in Piedmont, North Carolina became Wachovia in 1753. The drainage basin of Muddy Creek, a unique watershed of the Yadkin River, formed the backbone of the tract. The richness of water and resource abundance had attracted the Moravians to this landscape. By this mid-18th century period, indigenous people had already been pushed from the Wachovia land, and we acknowledge colonialization, land theft, and subjugation in America. 18th century Moravians were excellent planners and created an unparalleled place. By the American Revolution, there were 6 congregations in the Wachovia tract. European-born and derived people and African-born and derived people built Wachovia, which grew into the city of Winston-Salem, the county seat of Forsyth County, where there are now 26 Moravian churches and thousands of people descended from early families, like the Olivers. To North Carolina, the Moravians brought their global experience and worldview, education system, scientific inquiry, artisanal skills, and music. In many respects, the theocratic central town of Salem was a sophisticated place within a highly organized religious life. A university-trained doctor was always in residence, and music permeated everyday life. Some of the earliest chamber music in America was composed there. However, the barbaric institution of slavery was present in Wachovia from the first decade. The history is complicated and endures in the culture, landscape, and people today. Although he lived during the period of slavery in America, the African-descended Peter Oliver was not defined by that evil institution, but directed his life on his own terms within the white enslaving world. His birthplace was Virginia, where he was called Oliver. At about 18 years of age, he found himself in the Moravian community of Wachovia in North Carolina. He was a rented laborer in the Moravian town of Bethania. Fearful of his Virginia enslavers' plans for him, Oliver asked the Moravians to buy him more than once. Within a short time, and at age 19, he was living in Salem, the property of the Moravian Church. Like most religious groups in America, the Moravians did not object to slavery, but regarded one's place in life as ordained by God, with salvation the key. Oliver was baptized with the name Peter, and he became a Moravian single brother, but remained enslaved, a paradox. His home in Salem was the single brother's house. This iconic building with its 1769 half-timber portion represents architectural traditions brought by the Moravians from Central Europe to North Carolina. The all-brick section was added in 1785, the year Peter Oliver moved into the building. With baptism, he was a spiritual equal, living, working, worshiping with his fellow Moravian brethren. The integrated Moravian fellowship included worship and burial practices, as well as educational opportunities. Peter Oliver was among a very small group of enslaved Afro-Moravians in Wachovia. Ready to marry and interested in a woman in Bethabara, he was sent there to work in the pottery. And so began Peter Oliver's training in the Moravian pottery tradition, regarded as one of the finest in America during this period. Bethabara was the first Moravian congregation town in Wachovia, and the beautiful church or Gemeinhaus where Peter Oliver worshiped was completed in 1788, the year of his arrival in Bethabara. He was a tradesman in the Bethabara pottery shops of Rudolf Christ and Gottlob Kraus. The Bethabara pottery operation at that time is indicated by the circle on the map. Peter Oliver learned much from Rudolf Christ, but after a year, Christ moved back to Salem to take over the pottery there, and Gottlob Kraus became the master potter in Bethabara. Kraus was a gifted artisan, but cantankerous. He and Peter Oliver did not get along, and Peter Oliver successfully pressed for his rights. In 1966, the famous archaeologist Stanley South excavated Bethabara with a major focus on the pottery. Here he is examining the Christ Kraus pottery site where Peter Oliver lived and worked. After Bethabara, Stanley South excavated on the pottery in Old Salem. His important publication includes Bethabara and Salem pottery information during the time of Peter Oliver's participation. After 6 years under Gottlob Kraus in Bethabara, Peter Oliver was finally able to return to Salem and once more work for Rudolf Christ, this time at the Salem pottery on Main Street. Peter Oliver likely lived again in the single brother's house down the street. During Peter Oliver's work with Rudolf Christ in Salem, the master potter had expanded his operations across Main Street and built a succession of kilns for experimental and innovative pottery production. Peter Oliver worked with Christ in these places. Archaeology continues to explore these sites in Old Salem, and currently, archaeologist Jeff Hughes is leading an archaeology field school there. Pottery shops were led by the master potter with apprentices and journeymen, and pieces were not always signed. Peter Oliver is remembered for his work in the Moravian potteries of Bethabara and Salem, where products such as this was made. There is no attributable pottery to Peter Oliver, but it is no doubt that his skillful hands contributed to the renowned Moravian pottery tradition. He was a communicant Moravian by 1799, and the next year was a turning point, freedom. His liberation involved a complicated strategy by Salem's leadership with Peter Oliver. The plan also depended on Moravians in Pennsylvania, where slavery was unlawful by this time. Freeing Peter Oliver in Pennsylvania was less complicated than in the slave state of North Carolina. This document is Peter Oliver's signed sworn statement before the judge in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. There were costs involved, which Peter Oliver likely paid. With his artisan skills, he had built enough savings to buy his freedom. Peter Oliver's memoir recorded, quote, "He was true to his calling and work, and he brought it about through diligence in his work to the point that he could buy himself free from his status of slavery," end quote. Peter Oliver returned to Salem, where he was a respected community member and tradesman, and his social network was in Wachovia. The white population had increased, including non-Moravians, and there were 63 enslaved people and 8 free Blacks in Wachovia at this time. In Salem, slave regulations applied, and there were enslaved workers at the tavern and rented enslaved labor and domestic help in town, but no other free Black Moravians like Peter Oliver. In 1802, he married Christina Bass, a free woman of color working in Salem, who was soon baptized and also became a communicant Moravian. Peter Oliver leased a 4-acre parcel a few blocks north of Salem Square in a creek valley with a spring. Salem was a theocracy where the church owned all the land. He had a house built and the Olivers began their family. Peter Oliver is the only known Afro-Moravian householder in Salem. He farmed his land, worked as a church gravedigger, and sold pipe stems through the Salem store. He knew well the Moravian stub stem pipes produced by the thousands in pottery shops. The pipe heads required a reed stem in order to smoke, and the native bamboo growing along creeks supplied the material which Peter Oliver processed into pipe stems. Salem's community store records document his sales. Today, there's a stand of native cane along nearby Salem Creek in Happy Hill Park, and it is likely the reeds also grew by the creek on Peter Oliver's farm. Increasingly unwell at the end of his life, Peter Oliver died September 28, 1810, at 44 years of age. His funeral was held at Home Moravian Church on Salem Square, where the Olivers were members. The Salem Diary for September 30th, 1810 recorded, quote, "In the afternoon at 1 o'clock, there was the funeral of the Negro brother, Peter Oliver, who fell asleep on the 28th. In addition to our members and visitors, a large number of Negroes attended, and they were given the front benches. Brother Reichel spoke on the text for the day and led the liturgy on God's acre. The coffin was carried by Negroes," end quote. His burial was in the Married Brothers section of God's acre, not far from the graves of the 3 infants that he and Christina had buried years before. Fortunately, there were other children who survived to adulthood. Peter Oliver was one of the last Afro-Moravians buried in Salem God's Acre as segregation took hold. Old Salem and Oliver family members commemorated the 200th anniversary of Peter Oliver's death in 2010 with a service in St. Philip's Moravian Church that concluded at his gravesite in God's Acre. Peter Oliver was a beloved husband and father, a skilled artisan, a devout Moravian, and he is a revered ancestor. His life story is unique. Salem is the place he lived and that he knew so well, and he would recognize Old Salem today. Peter and Christina Oliver are among the founders and builders of Winston-Salem. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sabrina Garrity, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Moravian Archives. And I wanted to tell everyone here today a little bit about our archives and why we have such a valuable story and how we're able to piece together a narrative from these documents. The archives in Winston-Salem was established in 1753, as the Fabra was, and that's when we first have the records starting. And this is about 3,000 linear feet of records. So it is quite a large vault that we have that holds different things like personal papers, financial records, a lot of things that go into the material culture and daily life of people living in Salem at the time and the surrounding area in the Wachovia tract. As Martha mentioned earlier, this was a congregational town. So the church was in charge of education, who they were married to. They controlled all of the industry that was there as well. So that's why there is such a large wealth of knowledge. In addition to this, and it's important to note that many of the collection materials that we have are written in the Old German script. That is a dead text that less than 1% of the German-speaking population can read and write. So in order to actually access these documents, they have to be transcribed out of a different alphabet and then translated from German into English. So that does create a barrier of access to a lot of materials that we have there. And the archivist, myself and Megan O'Riordan, we are trained to do that, and past archivists have translated things as well, but I'll get into that in just a little bit. So in order to create this narrative about Peter's life, there's a lot of things that we've had to piece together from these documents. So because he was very well involved with the community, we do have so many things that we can access that really help us build what his life was like, what he was doing at different times, where he was. And that doesn't quite exist for everyone who was enslaved in this town at the time. But by using this method of research that has been replicated by so many people over time, and Martha, I have to say, is like the forerunner of this knowledge. She has worked at Old Salem for 40 years and really knows what she's talking about, and so many other people have as well. To replicate that, to make sure that this is something that we can do for other people as well. So I want to go over a couple of the documents that we have here, and some of these are outside for you to view today as well. In our collections, we do have about 67 bills of sale for enslaved people. Now, those are mostly comprised of people who were enslaved by the church itself, as individual enslavers were not allowed until a little bit later on. So this is from 1786. And what's really critical about these documents in terms of archival records and research is that there's so much that one can glean from it. You can take from where he came from. It usually includes an age in it, so you can date about how old that person is, even if you don't have an actual birth date for that person, who their enslaver becomes, what year it is, where they're at later. So it does really offer a lot of information for people doing research. And I also have one from later, and this one is when he's transferred back to Salem. So one of the critical things, and as was mentioned before, is he moves around in different cities in the Wachovia tract. And this is a way that we can tell where he was. So these are all really critical documents, not only for the fact that these are about a whole person being enslaved, but this is something that we can take so much information from to really build a life and see how this person was interacting with where they were, when they were there, and everything like that. This is his lease for the farm, and this document is also outside as well. And what I really love about this is that his signature is featured here as well as in several other documents. And here at the state archives with his will, you can see that his signature is not as clear, and you can tell that he was struggling to write. But he does have very beautiful penmanship, and I think that that's one of the things that we've really like to focus on, and his signature is such a feature in the Creative Corridors project to be able to see that as well. And when we're doing these kinds of research on enslaved people, there's a lot of different collections that one might not imagine being able to find information about someone in. But in our firefighting collection, we have rosters from every year from the time that they established the firefighting team. And so we could see on here that Peter Oliver is listed down here at the bottom. And that is in German script on the side. And it means that he was supposed to bring the ladders and a type of axe similar to a pickaxe to help get into the houses if there's anyone trapped inside. So with this, we can also see as he gets older, they have less intense, physically intense jobs, even though every adult male in Salem would have been a part of this. As he gets older, you see that his job becomes less intense and he doesn't have to climb ladders anymore or haul water, but he's there to make sure that everyone gets there and is part of like the bucket carrying team. So I have this one and another firefighting roster outside, but I think that there's something really special when you think about this, because this is a community that is coming together to fight fires, and the aspect of how much you would have to have trust in one another to do that. And because no one is trained as a firefighter, it's not like today when you call 911 and you expect a professional. This is expecting that people will be able to pull their weight and really depend on each other. And this is part of the memoir collection. And Martha quoted the memoir earlier of Peter Oliver's, but I wanted to bring note that memoirs in the Moravian faith are usually autobiographical if someone anticipates their death, if they're on a health decline and they know that they're going to die soon. They typically write them for themselves, or they're written by next of kin or the pastor. I like to think of these as a long form obituary. And in that, it has more information than one would typically expect. Instead of just the names of their family members and the age, it includes information about where they came from, why they chose what profession they did. Their interaction with faith as well is something that's mentioned a lot in these documents. And this is a good example of the old German script. It's a little bit faint because it's hard to read, but I do have this copy outside as well. for you to read. But you can really see here that it's a different alphabet that we're actually looking at. And with this, and I can kind of point this out, certain words like Christina are written in a Roman font that we're used to seeing. So you might be able to see some that you can recognize, which does make it a little bit easier for scamming to figure out what you're looking for. But this is something that takes a large amount of time to learn how to read and write in, and also to transcribe and translate. And I wanted to mention a little bit about the Salem diary as well. So one of the reasons why we have so much information about Peter is because in the Moravian faith, they also keep congregational diaries. So this isn't a personal diary of like, I was upset today. It's a note about things that were happening in the congregation, things that were happening in the town. It often is a record of weather, events that are happening in the community, things like that. There's some pretty spectacular entries relevant to recent. We recently saw the Northern Lights here as far south as here. But in around 1811, I believe it was, they saw the Northern Lights, and no one that was there at the time knew what was happening, and they kind of panicked. And then later, the next day, someone comes in and explains what it is. So they write about all of that. And so there's really unique little tidbits. And what I wanted to point out here is that there are certain places where when we're looking at this, people have made mistakes and crossed things out, and trying to include all of that information in what is transcribed and translated is quite difficult. And Christina Oliver, who after 1810, whenever Peter passes away, she is a widow at this point. She is living on the farm alone, and she has a relationship with a man named John Emanuel, and the church does not approve of this. And so this is something that was not included in what I'll discuss in just a minute, the records of the Moravians in North Carolina. This series was a compilation of all of those congregational diaries from Bethabara, Bethania, Salem, and the surrounding areas. She edited the first 8 volumes of this. But what's important to note about this is that she acknowledges in the beginning that you physically cannot include every single entry that's in here, and some of it might not be as relevant. But she was born in 1871, and her family, it was one of her ancestors was a very big proponent of slavery, and was one of the people who made it allowable for individuals to own slaves in Salem and the surrounding area. And so when we consider that someone whose direct ancestors are mentioned in these texts, there's a sense of wanting to control the narrative and have things reflect well on the church, have things reflect well on the community. And so there are a lot of things that were cut out of this record series that we need to go back and go through and make sure are included. And so this is something that I like to talk about particularly because Adelaide's series has kind of been assumed to be the most formative historical authority on all of this. However, there is a lot of error, omissions, and edits in this that needs to be recognized as well. So with this, and I mentioned this earlier, of replicating this kind of research method that's been done with Peter Oliver's history, and doing this with other enslaved people to make sure that their narrative can be shared as well. The Moravian Archives, we've started on a reparative description process. So this is including digitizing all of the documents, transcribing documents as much as possible from both English and also the German script, creating appropriate inventories. One of the problems with the inventories as they existed, one, they were in an analog format and in binders, which was terrifying. Archivists here just know that it was awful. When I walked in, I had so much anxiety. But digitizing those, creating inventories that are correct. A lot of those bills of sale and documents actually were not listing the person who was enslaved, but only listing the enslaver as the document title. And some things were item level described and some things were not. So going through and correcting all of that, making sure it's a comprehensive set of inventories, and also creating a research guide for individuals who are wanting to do this later to make sure that they can access all of this information. So with this, we're digitizing things not just from the collections related to slavery, but other collections that do have materials that relate to individuals so that we can include all of these into a research guide. And so if any of you know Megan O'Riordan, you know how much she loves Airtable at the SNCC conference. She talked about Airtable all the time. So we're going to create a database in which you can search by the enslaved person's name, you can search for year, you can search for gender and age, so that you can find out as much as possible and allowing people to really have an easier way to access all of these things. So translating the German text timelines for individuals and including pages for individuals so that you could see all of the things that are in their files. And then also hyperlinking all of these related collections so that one can see all of these things and where they exist. So this is a long process that we've embarked on, and I think that this is one of the things that we can take away from Peter Oliver's story is that there are so many descendants and his legacy is wonderful and this story is so great. But I think that one of the important parts of his story is that it's allowing us to do this kind of research for other people, his peers and the people that live there after him, and making sure that we can share that story just as well as his story is. So I'm going to hand it over to Georgia.
Thank you, Sabrina. I want to tell you that she did her master's thesis that was just completed on Peter Oliver and some of the content that she shared today. And so you got a glimpse of some of what she shares, and that we all get to share this information through our own lens. I think being here at the North Carolina Archives, where there are actual documents about Peter Oliver that are complemented by his estate and his final documents of his life, those documents are housed here. The documents that Sabrina has brought here is the first time they have been at this location in history. And so we're here at a moment to witness something of a life of pieces. We can only weave together some of these stories. I look forward to having you read some of the documents and look for how you hear the story of Peter Oliver, because we all do that through our own lens. And so his documents right now are in over 3 archives. The Freedom document that we've seen, it is in Pennsylvania. And so some of this story is lifted because the documents are in 3 states, 2 states, 3 archives, and numerous documents also with his personal signature. I can't wait for you to see the estate document that will be shared later. There's so much here, and I'm excited to be able to say that is why we're able to bring together a historic site through creative corridors, collaborating with the community, the city. We are very excited to bring together the Peter Oliver Pavilion Gallery. Creative Corridors, let me tell you a little bit about us. In 2007, we were formed as a nonprofit to really transform our city, the city of arts and innovation, with unique bridges and structures that would highlight our city. And so Walter Hood, one of the architects, and Donald McDonald came in and sought the creativity of our city to design this I-40 redevelopment of Salem Parkway, and then over Highway 52, the arches. It's like, how do you explain the arches? They're reuniting our city where the city had highways that went through that divided our city. And the special thing about this is it was done in collaboration with community in an extraordinary way and received over 10 awards on a state, local, and national level for the way it was done. We were able to work to allow over $5 million of private and public partnerships to help fund these betterments for our community, which are still in the works. Actually, I'll say on July 2nd, the multi-use path, which will be the east-west connector, that will have the breaking ground. And we are looking forward to another city resolution with the Peter Oliver Pavilion shortly. So Walter Hood is an internationally renowned architect. He is just finished the African American International Museum in Charleston. He's working on projects in Charlotte, all over Washington, DC, as well as internationally, other architectural projects. We were honored after he completed the Strollway Bridge that he would take on the Peter Oliver Pavilion Gallery. I'll say the significance is that the gallery, one of the 4 points of the 4 acres of Peter Oliver's farm, literally sits in Salem Parkway. And so when all of this was discovered just a few years ago, as Martha Hartley was actually doing the analysis on where the farm was located, and another board member, Steve Bumgarner, was in the room, and this connection was made, that aha moment of wonder when you realize exactly where someone lived, someone farmed, and the significance is it's in the heart of Winston-Salem. And I think that you will hear a little bit more about this through the video that I'll show you. This is a picture that Martha shared. Along this strollway, you'll see the map on the right, that it shows some of the other, what we call a pearl or a charm bracelet of interesting sites. Caladium, our children's museum. We have Old Salem along this unique set of places. And this will be another pearl on a charm of special places. Where the Peter Oliver Pavilion will be is also Muse Winston-Salem, with this a museum celebrating Winston-Salem. I'm now going to show a short film. With sound. Matt here. And so Walter Hood came to our city to launch the Peter Oliver site. As we were celebrating the bridges, we were also celebrating the launching of this Peter Oliver Pavilion Gallery. We had over 40 Olivers in the room and many others who have participated for a decade in the creation of making something unique and special about this site. And so Walter Hood, as the Strollway Bridge architect, was then able to come in. And I'm going to start this again. Is it a good time to start again? Okay, I'll skip it and we'll come back to it. It's an excellent film, so I'd love for you to be able to hear it. And I'll tell you, as Matt's coming up to help on the tech side, which we did test this earlier, and it was working. So thank you for your grace. We had over 40 descendants that day, but we also had individuals, all our family, participating in the naming. So we had 5 focus groups looking at what should the Peter Oliver Pavilion Gallery be called. We had dynamic time as the Oliver family would look at the representation of what the site could be and be involved with Walter Hood, the architect, in what this could look like. And I like to say we do these things in community. Obviously, we have to also do it in community with the city and what the city, fire standards are. So we've been meeting with the fire standards, with the city council, with all kinds of individuals who need to have a say in what a site like this would look like. And those we would want to have a say into the site that will raise up something beautiful for our city. So I'm going to go on to the next slide as they're troubleshooting. We can always come back to that later. And this is the Peter Oliver Pavilion Gallery. O stands for Oliver. You see it very clearly here. You'll see some of the Peter Oliver sign, his name is in clay. And I want to say that when he was baptized, Oliver is the name he was born with. He was baptized Peter. I think that's very significant, as any one of us who has family, the minute someone becomes a grandparent, or perhaps they teach in a school or have young people around, often they'll be called, like my friend Aubrey was called Mrs. Aubrey the rest of her life. And that gave a sense of honor. So this is Mr. Oliver, and the Oliver family literally came to be when Peter Oliver was baptized. And so the Oliver name began on that date when he was baptized. There'll be an area that has, this tells more of the story. This is his signature from when he signed for his personal emancipation. There'll be an area where people can gather for weddings, entertainment. There's a seating area. There is an area with displays. And so the historical displays that we're able to provide on the site are something that I'm most excited about as we work on the art and content, bringing this history to life in a way that you could go in a free area. As I grew up in Washington, D.C., to be able to access history and to be able to explore that on your own with visuals from the archives, visuals from the family. And I'd like to say that having this gallery, so it's an art gallery of sorts that will tell the history, significantly pointing at the Old Salem Museum and Gardens, so that we lift the community and the province, the Southern Province archives. I will go ahead and let you know that when we had the gala, we were able to move from introducing this to being on NPR on the national news program, and you can access that after this event. Sharing that story on a national level, local level, and we are excited to hear about some other possibilities that are coming up in the next 6 to 8 months. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to George Jones, and we'll loop back around to see that film if we're able to at the end.
I first want to say before I start that there's an African proverb that says, as long as the lion does not have its own historian, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. If we don't tell our truth, no one else will. And I'm grateful and thankful that 8 generations, there was a man who had a vision to tell his story. He was not only literate, he was also bilingual. He spoke both German and English. He probably wrote in English and German. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the relationship that Peter Oliver established. And as a descendant of Peter Oliver, the legacy in which he has been building. One of the things I want to say that I think is really important is, as a family, we're not only grateful for Peter Oliver's story. We just found out almost 20 years ago, less than 20 years ago. But what's remarkable is our family history. We've had family reunions year over year for the past 60 years. And we've had them in 5 locations around the country: Ohio, Washington, D.C., Roxborough, North Carolina, Durham, North Carolina, Winston-Salem twice. And that rotation has allowed family members to come together in celebration of our family and our history. I'm going to talk a little bit about Peter Oliver. As Martha mentioned, Dr. Mel White was instrumental in studying the genealogy of Peter Oliver's family. And it wasn't until he kind of went through this process that he realized there were people literally living in Winston-Salem that were descendants of Peter Oliver. And so this description here is an overview of that family legacy. And as he started sort of weaving the family generation after generation, he was able to locate some members of the Oliver family there in Winston-Salem. And when they started talking about the relationship to Peter Oliver, the name Oliver was still centralized, but there were other members of the family that were connected, including the Jones family. My grandmother was Roma Jones, but her maiden name was Oliver. And she was a descendant of Peter Oliver. And so when the families came together, they realized that it wasn't just the Oliver family, but it was the Oliver tradition that was being celebrated the most. And I'll dive in a little bit about that. Here's an image of my grandparents. They're on the far right. They're the second to the far right on this picture that you're looking at. The woman sitting down is Grandma Roma, and the man behind him, behind her is my grandfather, Willie B. Jones. She has 4 sisters on this front line. The two women to the far right are sisters, and the 2 women to the far left are sisters, and their husbands are behind them. And so these were children coming together to celebrate family. They were actually they were part of 17 children in the Oliver family. 17 children. And so that legacy continues. In fact, one of my cousins that lives up in Roxborough, we call him number 17 because May Parker, she was an Oliver also, had 20 children. And he just, instead of being called Reese Parker, he goes by number 17. So you figure that out. The thing beside that photo also is a crest. And this is our Oliver crest. My father was instrumental in getting the crest created. And I believe there's some documentation that he was able to get this registered with the state. Now, why does it say blood, trust, and service? I think this is a through line connected to Peter Oliver. In our family, we often say, learn to use your hands until you can wed or marry your head, hands, and heart. Learn to create a skill. Learn to be productive. Learn to use your hands, build your skills until you can wed your intellect and your passion. And that attitude has really built a reputation within our family that prides itself on being stewards, on being servants, on connecting with people where they are and engaging them. And so we have a family legacy of men and women who are servants and stewards in the community, public servants, private servants, people of commitment. And so I believe Peter Oliver gave us a blood trust, which was recognize not only your value, but also have the humility and the commitment to be of service to others. Now, I want to share something that I thought was pretty remarkable. As I was learning, and as I've been learning, listening to Martha, I mean, it's like a treasure trove of information. I mean, she can take you to places you really don't want to go. But the connection with Peter Oliver is still being uncovered. And I think that what's unique about our family now, and what's unique about all of our families, is that it's important to tell these stories. But one story I want to share that Martha shared with me just recently was that not only did he fight for his freedom or negotiate for his freedom, he had an internal clock, he had an internal compass that said to him, I'm free. I'm free. And so at his death, his wife and their children in 1810 were free. So he was buried in 1810. This is God's Acre and the cemetery on the right. And his headstone, as Martha mentioned, was changed over from Peter and Peter Oliver. It was just a small headstone. And we put a headstone now on the gravesite, and we recognize not only Peter Oliver, but his wife, Christina. Christina was born, I believe, or raised, I believe, in Person County. I think I remember reading something about Christina Bass being from from Person County. So not only are we just excited to have the history and the legacy of Peter Oliver, but this gives us another little connection to learning more about our family on the Christina Bass side. You can probably see this inventory. When Peter Oliver passed away in December of 1810, there was a legacy of things that were inventory. These were his personal properties, if you will. What, can you see this? At the very top of this legacy, he had a small bell. He had a Bible. He had stone pots. Again, he could read, he could write. He was literate in German and English. I'm not going to get preachy here with you, but that Bible was his source of energy, his navigable tool that gave him guidance, wisdom, and understanding, I believe, to navigate to freedom. I don't think he was selfish in the sense that he had freedom and no one else did. I think he was consciously educating, sharing, and helping others understand that value. So I think not only was he committed in the community of the Moravian family at Salem, in Old Salem, but he was committed to sharing that value of freedom to others. And I believe that he located, discovered, and understood what that freedom represented for him in studying the word. That's my thinking. But his legacy goes beyond just our family. It really goes beyond just the members of the Oliver family branch. It describes just what I think all of us recognize as an important value, which is how do we demonstrate freedom? How do we live it? How do we walk it? How do we become it? Which is still a chapter that we're still writing today. It's a chapter that we're still writing in these times. You know, what is freedom? What relationship do you have with freedom? I know my message is going to be coming to a close, but can I just elaborate on one more thing before I step off? When I think about my family, and I think about the legacy of Peter Oliver, the thing that really sort of gives me hope is that he was forward thinking about 3 to 4 generations beyond him. How many of us wake up every day thinking about planning, supporting, and preserving the legacy of our family 3, 4 generations out? That's something that we will carry. That's something that we value. That's something I want my grandkids and my children's children to value, which is how do we build a level of blood trust and service in such a way that that legacy continues? And to have a relationship now, 8 generations old, I can sit here and say, I am an 8th generation descendant of a Freedman. And so I don't have to think about what it is to be free, because that blood trust of service is in me. It's in all of us. And so walk with that, and I look forward to answering questions. Thank you.
As the formal part of the presentation is over, we'd like to open up for questions. Yes.
Well, Pennsylvania had a gradual abolition that began in 1780. And so over a period of time, it became illegal to have enslaved people in Pennsylvania. And as I mentioned in the lecture, the Moravians were already in Pennsylvania before Wachovia. Bethlehem, Lidditz, and other communities up there. So eh, my understanding of this whole process of freedom for Peter Oliver was well thought out and planned, and it was a strategy. And so Peter Oliver was sold to a Moravian from Lidditz, Pennsylvania, Peter Leonard, in early part of the year 1800. And this is recorded in the courthouse in Germantown, which was the county seat of Stokes County, which is where Wachovia was at that time. And so he was sold to Peter Leonard from the Moravian Church in Salem. And then soon thereafter, in the early summer, Peter Oliver went to Pennsylvania. Now, we don't know who went, if someone accompanied him or if he went by himself, but he had in his possession that record of his sale to Peter Leonard. He had records with him. Anyway, this is my understanding. Now, he goes up to Pennsylvania, and remember, Peter Leonard is a Moravian in Lidditz, Pennsylvania. And so they together go to the courthouse in Lancaster County, which is where Lidditz is located. And Peter Oliver appears before the magistrate. And you saw the document where we circled his signature that said he declares that he's held unlawfully in Pennsylvania because it's illegal by 1800 to have an enslaved person in Pennsylvania. So Peter Leonard could not do that. And so there's several other documents about this that a woman named Martha Tysenhouse Abel discovered in 2018, I believe it was. And these are on the web. You can look this up at Lancaster History. So the leadership in Salem and Peter Oliver obviously planned this strategy. And so Peter Oliver went there. He said, I'm held unlawfully. And the judge said, that's right. And you're free. So that's how it worked. Does that make sense? Because by that time it was unlawful to have enslaved people in Pennsylvania. In North Carolina, that wasn't the case. And there are other circumstances going on here in terms of more details that are happening in the Salem community, but that's my understanding. I don't know if you all have other takes on it, but it was a strategy to free Peter Oliver that he was very much a part of.
And I believe one of the things that I wanted to point out too is Peter Leonard's brother was a brick mason, and I believe that he came to Salem and Bethabara, and that's how this connection was established. And then this kind of plan was formed. And from what we've been able to gather, he also paid back Peter Leonard for the cost that it was to purchase him. So I think that it's something to note too, that he was able to earn wages while he was enslaved as well through side projects and things like that, with like the reed pipes, as we discussed, and other things too. So I feel like it's just important to also say that like they didn't just let him go. They did also want to be compensated for this as well.
I love what was mentioned because entrepreneurial is a word that we tend to see his agency, how Peter Oliver has many different areas that he raised up to be able to provide for his family that we have records for, and to provide in the community. Some, as an enslaved man, would not be by his choice. So we acknowledge that. And some would have been, we have some fun stories later at another time. So excited. Yes, Brenda.
For the archivist young lady in the middle, just from the technical side in my former life and working with microfiche and the machines, how are you bringing it up to date? And I know it's a tedious job because I used to do it.
Yeah.
And so to make it easier for someone to identify and research history, what's your process in that? And what type of equipment and stuff are you using now instead of that big machine we used to use that put everything on microfiche? So that's my question.
So we recently purchased a really fancy scanner. We call her Prudence. She's more expensive than my car. And so it scans not only documents, but also books at a really high DPI. So it's really easy to read and zoom in. Also, with this, we're putting this onto a digital repository platform that will be keyword searchable. We'll have subject terms included in this, full finding aids that are available through archive space as well. And what I'm planning to do for the research guide is to incorporate Airtable, which is a database that's searchable, so that you could see not only the things that are in these specific collections, but also related collections where you might find additional information, like the firefighting collection that I mentioned. Also, we have financial ledgers that might have things in it. Tax papers have things in it. There's a lot of places where you can find more little details that kind of help piece together the story. Additionally, for the kind of technical aspect of this, we've been working with Simon O'Riordan of Emory University's Rose Library. He is embarking on a process to create an AI transcription program. So all of these documents that I mentioned, the 67 bills of sale, I've digitized, and myself and an intern are going through and hand transcribing them and double checking each other to make sure it's correct. And then he's going to be running these documents through this AI transcriber to help make it so that in the future, once this program has really gained traction, it can transcribe manuscript documents from the 18th and 19th century and even earlier, so that this can be a process where keyword searches can be a lot easier for people to conduct. Also, we're doing, not on like the technical aspect, but we're doing a physical rehousing of our collection, so stabilizing all of these materials. I can't stress enough how stressful it was to walk into the archives for the first time and realize that all 3,000 feet were in flat file boxes. And I was like, what's in here? And then I was shown that it was documents. I was like, but why did they do that? And how do we go about fixing this? And it's box by box, folder by folder that we're doing this. And I think that that's something that we really have to consider, is each item has to be given this treatment. And so that's one of the aspects that takes a really long time, but I hope that answers your question. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Other questions? I'll say, as I would bring up a question for Sabrina, I would say, I noticed that his property, the 4 acres, there's 2 fire stations next to it. And I brought up this fire. Did he have anything to do with fire something? Because it seemed unusual. You know, sometimes a question doesn't make sense later on, that then she would find all of these documents. It felt like a treasure trove, and mysteries are yet to be found, both for the Peter Oliver family, as the information is sorted through page by page, and literally there are people doing that. And I just want to give honor to the archivists, to the archaeologists who are working currently. You're welcome to come by for the next 5 weeks. The dig site that's going on in Winston-Salem is just north of the Below House. So it's the big white house. They would love to have you come by, ask questions. Dr. Jeffrey Hughes has given a presentation that's also equally as good and riveting, really delving into the pottery and archaeology that has been going on the site for decades. I'd love to have other questions that have come up.
Thank you again for being here, for sharing parts of this story. It's really amazing to hear. And I appreciate you also, all 4 of you, emphasizing how important literacy was to Peter Oliver's life. I was wondering if there are records that show when he learned to read and write. Was that early in life, or was that when he joined the Moravian community? If there's any information on that, that would be great. Thanks.
I don't know that we know if he was literate when he was first a laborer in Bethania. I don't know that we know that, but becoming a baptized Moravian and becoming a single brother would bring to him the opportunity for education. So it's likely that he spoke English in Virginia. And then, of course, the common language in Wachovia was German. These were German speakers, but many of them were bilingual as well because much of the surrounding context is English speaking. So we don't know the exact moment when he learned to read and write, but that would be part of his experience as a Moravian single brother, would have those opportunities to read and study the Bible, which we know he was part of the process for becoming baptized anyway. So it may have been at that place, but I don't know what he came with. Do you have any idea?
Yeah, I don't think that we can speak to whether he knew how to read and write in English beforehand, but definitely, so when he is enslaved in Wachovia in 1786, he requests to be baptized, and it takes a little while for the approval process for that. But during that time, he is educated in the Moravian history and religious history as well. And I also want to point out that in the inventory that George shared with us, on the side, you might have seen it was on the far left or far right, sorry, page, there was a hymn book. That would have been something that could have been printed, but usually for Moravians, they also wrote their own hymns as they heard them and kept them for themselves too. So that would indicate definitely a level of literacy and being able to write as well.
I'm not going to give any kind of preacher stories because I don't have the artifact information to share that. But I will tell you that oftentimes in reading, you get inspired, you get motivated, you think about things. And so, as we talk about him being a potter, yes, he was a professional potter by definition, but by profession. But I think he was a preacher. I think he was a teacher. I think he was a farmer. I think whatever he had a vision to do, he was compelled to do it. So I don't want to box him into one category.
We do have an online question. Could you talk a little bit more about the free Black community in Salem and when it started?
Well, we know from an inventory that was done in 1803 or 1802 within Wachovia, I think there were 7 free Blacks. And of course, we know that at that time that would have included Peter Oliver and Christina. And so we also know from the records that there were free people of African descent at least in the post-American Revolution period, who were living outside of Salem, which is a really interesting thing to think about, and may have been leasing land. Champion, who you may know about, and some others. So there were certainly free people of African descent in Wachovia, but it was a small number. And I know by the federal census in 1860, which would be the last census before emancipation, 14% of the population in Forsyth County was enslaved, which included 1,766 enslaved people. And at that time, there were 207, I believe, free Blacks. So the number of free people of African descent was always very small, but there was a presence. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you all again for being here. This has been very informative and inspirational. You had mentioned during your research that after Peter dies, that Christina was living on the farm and that she was involved in a relationship with another gentleman. And you said you were going to mention it later about why this was unacceptable.
Right. So at the time, Christina is a woman of biracial descent, and there's a lot of social and class standards that are happening here that were at play with who Peter Oliver was allowed to marry and who it was acceptable for her to pursue as well. And so after Peter dies in September, by December and January of 1811, there are notes in the diary saying that John Emanuel, who was an enslaved man who was working just down in Salem, just a couple blocks away, he was visiting her at night. And the town did not approve of this behavior. And that part is recorded in the records of the Moravian series. Later on, though, there's a part that was actually, and not scratched out like what I showed you today, but scratched out with a pencil. And I believe that was by Adelaide Fries. And it's a passage stating that they had pursued a marriage on their own outside of the church. And this angered the town administration because they were still considering allowing them to marry. And she, I believe at this time, realizes that she's pregnant or that they catch on that she is pregnant. So by the end of February 1811, she is expelled from the community, evicted from her home, and excommunicated from the church. And what I think is just a terrifying bit to consider is how many miscarriages, stillbirths, and really traumatic pregnancy and childbirth stories she's had. And the doctor in town at the time actually brought her back to give birth. And that was not something that I think the town really approved of. And John Emanuel was punished for this relationship, but he was approved to marry a different woman later on, but it is much later. And in his memoir, it states that at one time he strayed from the faith, but then he came back into the fold. And I think that it is referring to the time when he was pursuing a relationship with Christina. And I think that this is a part of the story that doesn't get repeated as often because it is dark. And I think that in the past, it wasn't included in the records of the Moravians in North Carolina by Adelaide because she recognized how this would reflect upon the church to expel a pregnant woman out and at this time, Western North Carolina is sort of a frontier in February. But there is a relationship there. And I think that that's something that really doesn't get discussed. And there are children that come of this, two children that come of this relationship as well. But yeah, do you have anything to add?
Well, I would just say that we need to remember that Salem was a theocratically controlled place. The church was the government. And so there were definitely controls over behavior. And if this were white people, the same thing would happen. I mean, you would be excluded from the community. They definitely did not approve of illicit relationships at this time. And so, and we have, there is information in the published records of the Moravians about white people who have to leave Salem because they're wanting to marry or they're having a relationship. So, we have to remember the church was the government. So it was it was very strict for sure. I will say that the records and the published records in the Moravians, there are now 13 volumes. And as I've been told, that represents 1% of the holdings. Is that about right?
I can't imagine that it's even 1% when I tell you how many boxes are.
Yeah, I know. But the records of the Moravians were first published in 1922. Adelaide Fries was the translator and editor. And this was through the North Carolina Historical Commission. And as subsequent publications were. And so, as Sabrina has said, editors make decisions about what goes in and what does not go in. And so I will also let you all know that the records of the Moravians have been really important to Old Salem in terms of our work over the past 75 years. We also have had some private translators do translations of records. So we have some additional information. So it is just a remarkable treasure and legacy that we have all of this documentation. It's like a roadmap in many ways, but sometimes there are dead ends or you don't have the information because it's not published or we don't have access to other translations. So it will be really wonderful to be able to access this information in a more a broad-based way. So we look forward to that. But I have to say, I'm a user of the records of the Moravians in a big way, and they're excellent documents, and they are digitized and searchable. So it's a great tool, but they're not perfect.
It definitely needs to be taken with a grain of salt. I use them all the time too. I actually have several worn out copies in my office with plenty of Post-it notes inside. And it's one of those things where using it like that and then kind of taking it as a jumping off point to search further is a good way to consider it. And we are working to get the original diary entries, those pages and documents all digitized. But I cannot stress enough, and I think that you made a very good point. It's a massive collection, and it's not just one diary. It's Wachovia, it's Salem, it's the elders, it's the single brother's diary, it's the single sister's diary, all of these different books coming together that she's included in this. So it's really hard to just do, and it spans from 1753 to 18. When does it stop?
They're still
Yeah,
keeping
yeah,
diaries.
they're still keeping diaries, not as faithfully as they were before, but it's a really important resource, but something that does have to be considered with what the motives of the author were, or editor rather.
I'll tell you a few fun things. Old Salem, so many of the buildings are original. It far exceeds Williamsburg, which is also a great historic site, but the documentation that Old Salem has that is factual, it is a true treasure for North Carolina and our nation to have this. It's such an asset, and the work that's done there. I encourage you to come visit Old Salem if you haven't been, or if you haven't been lately, to tour. One other information, I think it's very interesting on pottery, one of the squirrels, these squirrels and fish, you'd seen the fish. One of those fish sold for $50,000. The squirrels are around 5,000 for actual items. They're collector's items, but in the way that you look at them, I have an example of Bob Timberlake's version of the Old Salem squirrel that's out on the table outside. So you can imagine the kind of craftsmanship it took to make that. We don't know that Peter Oliver actually made that, but it was part of what was being created during the time that he was part of the area. We invited you to the dig. We've heard that in the future, I'm going to say sometime in the future, 2025, that Finding Your Roots, which is a program on TV, that they'll be airing a story that may tie into some of this information. So be looking for that over the next year. I also want to thank in particular Kilpatrick. They are one of the sponsors for Creative Corridors. And we have received grants also from SECU, RJ and Marie Reynolds, the Z. Smith Foundation, and Peggy Taylor. I will do a shout out for her as well, as we are in a place of engaging to make the Peter Oliver Pavilion Gallery come together. I'm hoping that this will play, that since Matt did this, it's only 4 minutes, and we're gonna see if it does. And if it doesn't, that's okay, but it's great. We'll send a link out that you'll be able to access after the event is done. And I'll say, if there aren't any other questions, we'd love to engage with you at the tables at the back. There's also snacks to the left. Thank you to the North Carolina State Archive. Thank you so much for having us here. If you're an Oliver and able to stand, would you please, if you're an Oliver descendant, would you mind standing? We would love to give you honor
My
today.
sister and my mom.
Please know that all the speakers are here. There's lots of content online. Please, as your inquisitiveness leads you, we just encourage you to keep going in this story and the stories of our community in North Carolina. Thank you so much. The table is down on the right-hand side. Thank you. So if you exit the building, there's food on the left, and then down to the right, you'll see the archival documents. One of them that I loved personally is St. Philip's, which was the African-American Moravian church that was established after Peter Oliver died and things separated. And in it are recorded Nancy Oliver and Israel Oliver, their two names when they were baptized. And that was a page that I saw today for the first time, actually, and it just was one of many that I think you'll enjoy seeing. So that is just down the hall to the right. You'll also see the boards of the Peter Oliver Pavilion, and we'll be happy to, we'll be down there to show you and tell you more of the story. Thank you so much. Have a great day. We enjoyed having you here.